So I grew up raised on Christian values, even attending Catholic private school for a couple of years. And despite this, I was a standout problem child and never really believed any of it at all. I found some of the stories from the Bible interesting, but nobody in my family really forced the religion on me. I just happened to be within a family that held mild Christian values. And with that being said, none of them were really devout Christians themselves. This is important because it should be understood that I was quite aware of Christian beliefs, but never actually took them as truth. Now let's just jump forward now to my teenage years where this all began. At the age of 12, I was engaged with all things mystical and mysterious. I read books and browsed websites on everything between ancient aliens, conspiracies, ghosts, mediums, witchcraft, Illuminati, and the demonic. And this was around 2003/4, so just past the turn of the millennium. All of these things were of great interest to me, but I had no actual evidence or reason to believe any of it. It wasn't until my family had made the decision to move that these things became more viable. My parents had locked in on a house that they thought was perfect for us and were close to closing the deal. My mother wanted her mother, my grandma, to come approve of it first. And while I ran around the empty rooms trying to decide where I would have my bedroom, my mother showed my grandmother around. After the tour was given, my grandmother felt uneasy about the house, specifically the second floor. She didn't like the way that it was set up and worried what would happen if there was a fire while me and my sibling were up there. And this wasn't enough of a reason to deter my mother, though. And after they checked over the potential new home, we proceeded to head back to the car. While on the drive, my mother mentioned to my grandma how she was weirded out because she could have sworn that she saw a little girl staring at her from the second floor window. Now this led my parents to investigating the history of this house, and they had found to their amazement that there was in fact a fire on the second floor of this house many years prior, and that a young girl had perished in those flames. And with that said, that strange coincidence was not enough to stop them from trying to buy the house. It was actually the fact that upon inspection there was found to be a roach infestation, and my mother would not have any part of that. And this led us to finding our actual new home in another nearby town. This house was approved of much quicker and had the okay of my grandmother as well. So a couple of business days go by and we are pretty much all moved in and set at our new home. And this is when we get a knock at our door. Turns out it was the woman who had previously lived there who sold us the house. She wanted to pass a message on to us. The message being that her mother had died in the house and that she would occasionally appear, but that we shouldn't worry because she was friendly and was just attached to the house. Now, we will keep this on the back burner for now. Now, cut to a few weeks later, I had made a new best friend who lived down the street from me. My house number was 112 and his was 12, and I thought that was pretty cool, but no special meaning there. Now, it wasn't long before I became close with this family, and they in turn became close with my parents. We would regularly visit each other's homes for get-togethers. The first get-together we had, my friend's parents asked mine about the move, where my parents filled them in on the details. And this is where things got a little strange. To our surprise, my friend's family actually lived in the house that we were looking at prior for a good decade. And when they proceeded to say that they moved because the house was incredibly haunted, they said that there were 2 different ghosts in that house, one of which was a young girl, and the other, a malevolent old man. This shocked my family, and so far, intuition was on point. My friend had 3 older brothers, 2 younger brothers, and 2 younger sisters, one of whom they adopted, and they also ran a daycare out of their house, so it was quite packed on the daily. Each of the older brothers had traumatizing hauntings happen to them in that house, and the oldest brother, who was 21 at the time, still wouldn't sleep with the lights off because of it. And this was the first point in my life where I've seen multiple people confirming and agreeing upon spiritual activities in a real capacity. Now let's jump forward to about the age of 14. Now, following my same interests, I was fascinated with the ideas of ghosts and spirits. I wanted nothing more than to interact with them in some way or another, but despite the past mentionings, I myself hadn't seen one single shred of their existence. It was frustrating, and I tried all manners of contact, bought crystal balls, stared into mirrors in the dark, looked into black ink, researched Enochian, literally everything under the sun, but nothing would work. And this is until I opened a Ouija board on my 15th Christmas. And there is one message to take from this entire thing is that I tell you from the bottom of my soul, do not engage with a Ouija board, period. I didn't immediately use it, but one day my friend and I were chilling per usual, and I had remembered the new Ouija board that I had gotten for Christmas. And I asked him if he wanted to use it with me, and he hesitantly said yes. I made him go down into the basement with me because where else would be the perfect place to use it? I had just opened the box and placed the board when my friend chickened out on me. And I mocked him and told him, I'm gonna do it by myself then. And I placed the little piece of the board and proceeded to ask it questions, but to no avail. Nothing. I was extremely disappointed, and I thought for sure that it was going to be it, but no. I put it back in the box and brought it upstairs, and that was that. Or so I thought. But boy was I wrong as wrong could be. Immediately over the next couple of days, I started experiencing things that were unusual. Simple things at first, like lights being funny, my dogs acting strange, objects and doors moving. This, however, was spectacular to me. I had no fear whatsoever. If anything, I was extremely excited and more into the occult than ever. I thought that this is it, what I've been waiting for, paranormal activities. And these types of things continue for the next couple of years steadily. And then it finally happened that I saw my first ghost ever. I was 16 at this point, and I had been making my way from the kitchen through the dining room towards the living room. And while I was gapping between the kitchen and dining room, I had seen what I thought was my mother walking towards the kitchen from the connecting hallway. I took note in my peripheral of her pink dress, which threw me off a bit because my mother normally doesn't wear such a thing. It wasn't until I made my way through the dining room to the living room where I had seen my mother and father sitting on the couch watching a movie. This instantly made me take 5 because I realized my mother not only was not wearing a pink dress, but was not in the hallway going to the kitchen. I proclaimed to my parents instantly of the shock and surprise that I was in, but they just sort of shrugged it off and continued with the movie. I didn't press the issue because I was now elated with the fact that I had actually seen a ghost, and I had instantly presumed it to be the prior owner's deceased mother. I would go on to look at her as a guardian spirit of the house, so to speak, though I never did see her again. And this event was ultimately a bad thing because it put me more at ease with the idea of communication with the dead. I took her spirits as an example of what all spiritual beings would be like, which pushed me further into looking for such things. However, over the next 2 years, things progressed for the worse. I developed insomnia. There would be random spots in the house that would make your blood run cold. Doors would knock over and over, and things would be thrown out of closets and off dressers and shelves. One of the more creepier occurrences would be electronics acting without electricity. Dolls would speak their recorded sounds on cue without batteries, because I had taken the batteries out of all such things to try and prevent this, and lights would go on and off repeatedly. I'd even have TVs go white static and start blasting max volume. I would unplug them, and it would stay on and go louder, and this scared the straight crap out of me, literally getting chills through my body reminiscing about this right now. And these weren't things where I would question other possibilities. These were things seen as nothing other than what they were, impossibilities. And there was one night in particular where it clicked and the fear had taken permanently a hold of me. I hadn't recently at the time gotten into the Harry Potter books. I'm a big reader as a youngster, and I was sitting on the couch in my basement, which was now redone as a TV room, where lots of things would happen. I had one of those little bendy lamps used for reading books as my only illumination. And I was thinking to myself how great these books are and how I thought it was funny people at the time thought that they were the devil. And I kid you not, as I'm in this thought process, the light bulb explodes, projecting the glass of shards at me. Luckily, no harm was done, but I instantly hopped up in fear and ran out of my basement to escape the dark. I flew up the basement stairs where dolls started going off. Some bins of toys were kept under these stairs, and the fear jolted in me. I sprinted even faster and finally opened the basement door and reached for the hallway light switch in front of me, flicking it as quick as I could. Again, I kid you not, as soon as I did, the hallway bulb exploded. At this point, I'm thinking, there's no freaking way any of this is happening right now. And this has happened 2 more times again in the living room and once more on the second floor once I made my way up those stairs. 4 light bulbs exploded in total. Now again, I'm quite rational. Despite these things, I am aware that this could be a very coincidental electrical wiring problem, but everything that ultimately happened says otherwise. I made it to my bedroom on the second floor where things normaled out and I finally had light. And it was at this point in life where these experiences were taking a huge toll on me, really ramping up my insomnia. I was in constant fear while at home due to these things happening left and right, and some of the things so common I barely batted a lash at them. Now before we get to the big one that I want to give just a few more descriptors of everyday occurrences at this point. And while laying in bed, I would do everything in my power to avoid looking at my closet, which had a nasty habit of opening wide so I would be gazing straight into a dark void. And before you say draft, I might add that I would lock and blockade it regularly, and no matter what I did, this freaking door would push itself wide open, moving whatever blocked it right out of the way. And it got so bad that I tried bargaining with it, telling it it was free to do what it wanted as long as it wouldn't open on me while I was trying to sleep. I'm 33 now, and I tell you as a well-rounded adult that this was not mind tricks. And it's not every night, but quite a few of them, I would feel things crawling beside me onto my bed. Not in the general sense of where your mind is questioning if you're actually feeling or not, but in the sense of the spring mattress would straight indent and compress as the invisible force crawled right beside me. Again, this scared the hell out of me, and I would freeze in fear. And the last occurrence that I would see all the time affected other people, and due to my sleeping problems, I was always the last one to fall asleep. I witnessed multiple times people's arms being raised in their sleep like they were reaching for the sky. And there was a day when I had a cousin and 2 friends crashing over, and I watched as one of their arms was rising in the air. It made me feel like whatever this was taunting me, showing me that it could do whatever it wanted to whoever. The real kicker is when I was sleeping on an air mattress in my younger brother's room, 4 years younger, and I did this because at this point I was so terrified to sleep alone that I needed to be near someone to feel somewhat safe. And as I was dozing off, I watched my little brother's arms raise into the air. And the only difference this time is that he actually woke up while it was happening. I watched him groggily realize what was happening to him, and he jumped to his feet, turned and ran into the freaking wall out of terror and panic. And I legit started laughing because I had never seen anything so absurd and shocking in my entire life. And the way his feet moved like an old cartoon, like he was Sonic the Hedgehog, the way the blankets jumbled beneath his scurrying feet, and the sheer speed at which he'd hopped up and darted into the wall. Safe to say, both my brother nor I got any sleep that night. So, if you made it thus far, you understand at this point whatever is going on has been ramping up and becoming more bothersome by the day, and this is where we climax. I had grown quite brave at that point because these things were so regular and common that I simply just became used to it and was able to sleep solo once again. So there I am, lying down on the couch against the furthest back wall in my basement. This was generally where I slept and hung out at this point in life. I had 3 dogs, one of which was a little white chihuahua named Baby, and she was the most timid, docile, scaredy cat of a dog that you can imagine. Everyone who has pets understands that you come to learn the general behavior of them, and I just turned off the lights and popped onto my back where my little baby jumped up to sleep on my chest like she always does. And this is where the single most terrifying thing of my life happened. Baby instantly goes to alert and stands up growling in the darkness. She does not ever act like this, and her fur is raised and her fangs are bared. I can immediately perceive that this little dog is trying to defend me from something despite her tiny stature. And this puts me on full alert, and I sit up to also peer into the darkness while she just stood guard on my lap. And the next thing I know, she cowers, her tail goes between her legs, and she whimpers and flees. And before I can gauge what's happening, my arms were pinned straight down to my side, and my back was forced straight down into the couch. I can see enough to tell you with 100% certainty that there was nothing there. While forced down, it feels as if I was pushed 5 feet through the couch, like my soul was straight pushed out of my body. and I was so consumed by fear that there wasn't a single thought in my head other than static and panic, and it seemed like forever, but in reality it was probably only 10 seconds. And as soon as this force let go of me, I hopped straight up in my undies and darted through the darkness toward the stairs. And this is the part that I want to make crystal clear, because this right here is the part that you never want to experience. Those who think the paranormal and ghosts are cool have not experienced the sensation I am about to describe. I tell you, I felt a tangible hatred that was unlike anything I've ever felt. It was the feeling of something that hated every fiber of your being and wanted nothing more than to destroy every last bit of you in the most malevolent way possible. It was inhuman, the sensation. It was in this moment I understood hell is real, and this was something from there. There was no doubt in my mind. It was a sense of knowing, absolutely. It was the predator, and you were the prey. I scrambled room to room in my house, and just like before, every light bulb started shattering, and I just couldn't escape the darkness. I made it to the second floor and burst into my parents' room screaming. And I swear on everything that they would just not wake up. I shook them and yelled. Nothing. I then ran to the only other person in the house at the time, my little brother. Same thing. He would not wake, and it was like trying to shake somebody out of a coma. And I tell you in all honesty, I was 18, considered myself a man at this point, and I had loads of pride. Still, this did not stop me from hopping right into my brother's bed next to him, pulling the blanket over me. Now you would think at this point that I was safe. No. This thing repeated what it did in the basement. It took hold of my body over and over, and I could feel my mind breaking and my soul dying right in my very body. After the 10th time, I was just completely hopeless. I had almost given in to defeat and on the verge of being scared to death and just demolished by these demons. And this was when I remembered something I heard many times from my Christian upbringing. Pray to Jesus. And I swear to you on my eternal soul and all that I love and hold dear, the moment that I cried out to Jesus, this stuff stopped on a dime. 15 years has passed at this point, and I've not experienced a single thing mentioned ever again. And I haven't even come close to getting the feeling that something paranormal is near me. Every single bit of the experience has vanished. And for the next year straight, I started praying at night, spending at least 15 minutes per night before going to bed through all my prayers. And though I don't pray as much, and I am every bit as faithful, if not more, at this point in my life, however, that's not the complete end to this saga. The very next morning, I tried to explain to my parents what had happened. Now, I can't say that they fully believed me, but they at least listened enough to help me out. I thought about how it all seemed to start when I first used that Ouija board, which led me to doing a quick online search of how to dispose of those kinds of things because I did not want that thing or portal anywhere near me again. It said online that the only way to truly close a Ouija board is to burn it, and so that same day my parents and I brought it out back to the fire pit. Now, I must say that I was hasty here and left the bidding to my parents because I didn't even want to look at that thing or be near it anymore. Funny enough, it was years later that I was regaling the events with my mother where she gave me a bit of surprising news. And she proceeded to tell me that she did in fact believe me because that day, unbeknownst to me, the Ouija board would not burn. She expressed how she and my father doused it with gasoline and it just sat there unscathed. They ultimately threw it out into the trash can and watched the dump truck take it away, and I figured that must have been good enough because, again, nothing ever came back. And I like to imagine that it eventually got incinerated at the junkyard at some point. And that's pretty much the end of that, but I can still provide one more happening that I found quite coincidental. When I was speaking of my mother and father, it was really my mother and stepfather. I say this because when I finally told my blood father this ordeal, he went on to tell me all about how he was severely haunted in his youth, and similar to me was a non-believer who happened to call out to Jesus for help. Now, I can't say for certain, but this has led me to believe that there may in fact be some kind of hereditary thing going on here. And like I started out saying, I've not fabricated or embellished even one bit of this. I have pondered the thoughts of such things as mental disorders, but to that degree I have two things to go against that. One, doctors have continually found my mental health to be fine, and 2, no matter what the case, it stopped forever on the drop of a dime the moment that I called out to Christ. And there may be a few more things that I'm blanking on at the moment because I've been writing this for the past 2 hours or so, and I'm getting to that point where my brain is starting to fizzle, but I'm more than happy to take on and answer any questions about my demonic experience. So long-time listener, first-time submission. And I notice a lot of them are longer form. Typically, I tell these two events separately, but they take place so close together, and they're so similar you might as well make one long story. Now, the side effect is that by the end of it, it's probably going to sound pretty far-fetched. A bit too much for some people, but I assure you, everything you're about to hear here actually happened to me. So I might as well start from the very beginning then. This all takes place in the early fall of 2003, probably starting sometime in September, but a couple of weeks go by. So I'm a high school senior, but don't have any driver's license yet. And I don't remember what the inspiration was, but my best friend Mark and I were on an urban exploration kick at the time. We'd been to some abandoned houses and barns and stuff like that, and there was even this place called the Underground Gas Station right down the street from school. It wasn't actually underground. It was a concept design from the 70s where it was hidden from the road with a ton of trees rather than in-your-face signage. It was pretty cool, but it's townhouses now. We were getting bored with the obvious stuff out there. We needed a better target. And somehow I landed on this place in the general area called Little People Village. And this is where the chain of events really kicks off. LPV itself isn't integral to what happens later, but it's worth talking about for a minute. I think I found it on an Urban Legends or Creepy Locations website, the same kind that you'd find Dudleytown on and various abandoned asylums. You should still be able to find pictures of it online today. That last part with asylums does come into play later, though. Now anyway, the legend behind LPV was that it was this crazy artisan who built a tiny intricate stonework village in the woods. It also had an ominous stonework throne that felt out of place, like he was the ruler of the little people. And so the thing with the throne is that whoever sat on it got cursed and died 7 years later. Yeah, totally believable. Now the problem though, the description of the location for LPV was absolute trash back in 2003 from multiple sources. They were contradictory and vague, and it's much more accurate on modern sites. And that meant that we had a lot of ground to cover and locations to scout, which all does lead to Event 1, so just bear with me a second. Now eventually we found it several miles away from where we started. It's wedged in between the greenbelt next to a highway exit and high voltage power lines. Turns out it was a roadside attraction during the time of trolley lines and smaller parkways. The trolley line went defunct once the interstate popped up. It is quite creepy, and you can see evidence of an old throughway. And yes, I sat on the throne. Now early in our search for LPV, a few exits further up that same interstate, we decided that this abandoned nursing home or hospice care complex was a fine alternative to turning up empty-handed on our main quest. Now the side quest it is, I guess. Ironically, we went here far more times than we did LPV, way easier access, and I'd say the two of us probably hit this spot over a dozen times easily before the spot got too hot. And the encounter that I'm about to get to was somewhere in the middle of all of our visits. But first, a bit about the complex layout. There were a few buildings that were not connected, so I'll just talk about the main one where this takes place. It's shaped like a T, or that Tetris piece, with a central hub of sorts on the ground level. It's 2 floors with a basement. Each of the side wings have a stairwell, and the central one had the non-functional elevator. The only way into the building was from a busted-out window on the side of the basement. I hated that basement. It gave me the creeps, man, and you get dumped in from the window into this huge open space with a piano, a stage, and these creepy murals on the wall. And they reminded me of the murals that you would see in Cold War-era communist Eastern Europe. The place had plenty of evidence of prior activity, mostly degenerate teens spray-painting things, smashed stuff, and dead birds. And a couple of code browns and a few toilets, if you know what I'm talking about. Now, I never saw any squatter camps or used needles or anything of that sort, and the two of us explored every inch of that place. We knew all the nooks and crannies, the hidey holes, all of it. Oh yeah, there was this one room upstairs, though, and the floor was covered in what looked like dried blood. No, alright, on to the main event already. Now Mark and I are in the central hub on the ground floor. This particular day, we brought our very realistic-looking BB guns along, and we were having a grand old time shooting random stuff that got left behind in the cleanout. It was all vandalized already after all, so who really cared? And now we had already been in there for a good 40 minutes and covered all the ground, mind you. Now all of a sudden, from directly above us, we hear full tilt running to our left down that side wing. The person above us sounded like a tank of a guy, easily over 6 foot and 250 pounds, wearing some very heavy-ass work boots. Foolishly being teens with fake guns and Mark being a tough guy, we just looked at each other and ran to either stairway. He went down the hallway to the one that we heard the running in. I went to the other one to cut them off in case they doubled back. The footsteps never made it back to the stairway. Now remember, you have to go into the basement to get out of the building, and the noise was on the second floor, and those stairs are the only way to the basement. So we devise a plan. He starts on his end of the corridor, clearing each room. I stay in the corridor, and then we alternate back and forth. There was nobody there. It was like they just vanished. A big guy like that ain't gonna fit in a hiding spot somebody my size can fit into, and we all knew the spots no matter what size you were. The only conceivable place we didn't search too hard was the ceiling, but it was a drop ceiling and there was no way that it would support someone that size. We went hard searching for about 45 minutes and just called it and decided to leave. It was just starting to get dark by that point anyway. We make our way out the place and walk back to his truck tucked into the far corner of the lot out of sight. And maybe by about 30% of the way back to the truck, we both just kind of froze all of a sudden. We both hardcore got the feeling that we were being watched. Without saying a single word, the two of us simultaneously turned around slowly. In the second floor corner window by the stairs, there's some type of disembodied head looking straight at us out the window. You know the stereotypical ghastly-looking emaciated gray dead ghoul-looking trope? I could keep describing it, but I think that gets the point across. It was just there. No torso attached to it, no hand holding it up. It kind of had this mist to it as well. Even if you looked at it like, okay, there was a squatter in there, the noise from the running does not match the person in the window. And I leave this one at least open to interpretation, but I know what we both saw and heard, and that was not a living person. That place never gave us another encounter of either variety, so I'm not really sure. And lots of people died there, though, after all. I wonder if this new condo complex they put in there is haunted or not. Now, alright, on to the second event in this narrative. I don't recall this happening before the hospice or after, but it's within a couple of weeks of each other. Remember when I mentioned asylums? Well, here's one for you. This one was tucked back maybe half a mile down a service road in the woods connected to a busy highway overpass and exit that was next to our local mall. Rest in peace to the mall these days. Now, the backside of the complex is rather large, a trap rock ridgeline connected to this awesome state park, and one side is the highway. Now, I probably found it through the same early websites, but it was right there in our stomping grounds, so we couldn't resist. And the place was called Undercliff Sanitarium. You can still find documentation of it online, but it got demolished in 2014 or 16. Now, I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but I want to say that it was shut down in the 90s along with many of the others around the country. It was known for treating children with tuberculosis and other diseases, troubled children, mental patients perhaps. And the thing with this facility is that it was still half operational, only in a different capacity. There were a lot of buildings in that complex on that service road. The problem is that it was all State Department facilities, including a state police barracks since it had easy access to both highway directions. I found this old picture of an ancient HDD that I got on an Urbex forum that shows all the various security cameras and what building had what in it. And yeah, the safest way into there was traversing the ridge and looping around the far back. And that's not what I did either. I found that picture way later, and I was like, yep, that makes sense now. And just to give you the sense of security that that place had, Later on that school year, I tried going there with a friend of mine and these two chicks one night, and the plan was to drive around the loop that circled the main building all the way in the back and leave and take a few pictures on my digital camera while doing so. I got 2 pictures on the front facade and 1 around the side, and by the time we got around to the back of the building, there were 3 squad cars surrounding us, and I'd say that we were less than 1 minute. Now 1 more and we would have been out of there. Trespassing tickets for everybody, I guess. They do not mess around. I never actually got to go inside, but if you dig around online, you'll find a lot of explorers here. Now moving on, myself and Mark head over there in his 90s manual Ford Ranger one fall afternoon. We had no idea how tight the security was, but thankfully, we chose to check out one of the first buildings you come across in the complex. But we did have the right idea to park behind the building on a small concrete courtyard on the opposite side of where most of the surveillance actually was, so that turned out to be fortuitous. This building wasn't all that big. It was an auxiliary something or other, and I guess somewhere in the 3 to 5K square foot range perhaps. And we get out of the truck and lock it up. And that part's important because the Ranger is manual everything. Transmission, locks, windows. We locked up the doors and windows, including the rear slider. And he also had one of those diamond plate toolboxes in his bed that had its own keyed lock. At this point, we decided to do a perimeter walk around the building to see if we could locate an entry point or not. It couldn't have taken more than 2 minutes tops. And it's about the same size as my house. I've tested how long it takes me to walk around that. And as we round the corner, having not found an easy entry point, we both stop dead in our tracks when we see the truck. Whatever could have opened up on that Ranger was wide open. I'm talking all the windows, doors, tailgate, toolbox, hood, glove box, center console. There simply wasn't enough time for somebody to have picked all of that and then disappeared. The general area wasn't exactly the best. There were some hood projects down the street, but that wasn't it, as we're like a quarter mile into the woods. Not only that, but I would have expected to get robbed too. It wasn't the cops either, as I illustrated earlier. We both decided to just get the F out of there, as all of this was just too weird. When we got back to the house, I went on what was called my command center to do a little clickety-clacketing online, and I found this website that I hadn't seen on Undercliff. You can still find this info up today, and upon reading the site that afternoon, I had my holy crap moment. There were some stories on there, man. One of them was exactly what happened to us like an hour prior, to a T. And I'm thinking, dude, come on here. You have to read this. So in our case, the long and short of it is maybe in the 1930s, there was some kid who was stabbed to death with a shank by other kids who were at the facility, in that courtyard that we parked on. I think the accounts mentioned mischievous activity in that area for the most part. And once I found that picture with a security detail that had an aerial view of the complex, I confirmed that the building we parked next to would be the only one that fit the story in the facility. It's a shame I never got into the main building before they demolished it, and I'm sure that if I had, I probably also would have experienced some of the stories that are centered around that building. And so after all of that, you can see how this sounds kind of outlandish, right? Such a short period of time and 2 significant paranormal encounters. Yeah, okay, but as I mentioned in the beginning, I swear this is all true. And for what it's worth, it's not like I see stuff like this all the time, but I have experienced a handful of other paranormal encounters. They were all not only very different styles, but at very different points in my life, and I actually lived in a haunted house until I moved for high school. Now, I tend to err on the side of a skeptic, but I know what I've experienced, and I've never hallucinated in my life. I know a man's word on the internet doesn't mean much, but I've had other witnesses in every case, so don't just call BS. For some reason, I never thought about posting my story here, and I've posted on YouTube comments before, and I think I've talked about it on my YouTube show before. But anyway, it started when I was 5 or 6, which would have been 1988 to 1989, and I would see what was called the Bloody Man walking up and down the stairs in my house. I can't remember his face. I'm not sure if it's because I never looked at it or he didn't actually have one. I just remember it would never be the middle of the night, but more like bedtime that this would always happen. He had a bandage on his head that was bloody and a hospital gown. I remember having a feeling that I knew this wasn't right, but I wasn't scared. I'm not sure if the lack of fear was due to being told not to be scared somehow, or if I was just so young that I didn't know how to be scared. Now anyways, this person that I would come to learn later in life, was my uncle. He had been beaten in the head with a baseball bat, came home, brain swelled in his sleep, and was taken to the hospital by the family in the morning, where he died several days later. Now this was August of 1982, and I was born in December of 1983. There's much more to the story, both his life and that night itself, but I'll hold off on that for now. I saw the bloody man somewhere in the range of 15 to maybe 30 times, and then my mom and I moved out of there to get our own place, and this was my grandfather's house, and I was gone for 5 years. Around 12 or 13 years old, I moved back to that house, and while I never saw the bloody man again, it was far from the last paranormal encounter I would have in that home. And after being back around 5 to 6 months or so, one day I was showing my little sister how to play a Sonic the Hedgehog game, and as I'm explaining it to her, as clear as day, a female voice says her name. And my sister instantly got up and went to the door and said, "Yeah, Ma?" And I was frozen solid in fear. Now this was for 2 reasons. The first was that I knew for a fact that that wasn't my mom's voice that said my sister's name. It was my grandmother's, who had been dead for 10 years. The second thing I knew was that my little sister didn't seem to realize was the voice had not come from downstairs, it came from right at our feet by the foot of the bed. And I just sat there frozen in fear while my sister yelled for my mom, who of course said that she had been washing dishes and never called for her. My sister then sulked while walking back to the bed. "What's the matter?" I asked her, and she said, "I hate those stupid stairs. The bloody man is scary." So I started asking her who had told her about the bloody man, and was it any of my friends, etc., etc. And she was in shock that I knew who the bloody man was, and was crying for me to believe her that she really sees him, and none of my friends had spilled the secret to her, and she was about 5 at the time, same age I used to see him. The next part of the story involves all my friends. Every sleepover after hearing my grandmother's voice, my bedroom door started shaking. Thinking it might be my stepfather, we would open it as it was shaking and no one would be standing there. And upon realizing this, the shaking would terrify us. So every sleepover for about a year, the door would shake and these horrible claw-like scratching sounds would go down the door. My friends and I would fight to hide in the corner of the bed while it would happen. So if you're keeping count, that's me and my sister who both saw the bloody man and heard the female voice, and 3 of my friends who witnessed the shaking and clawing at the door. 5 people. But believe it or not, the last part of the story gets even crazier. We sold the house and moved a couple of cities over about a year later. One thing I forgot to mention is the reason I moved back at 12 and 13 is my grandfather had a bunch of mini strokes and was in a wheelchair, so my mom moved back in to take care of him. Well, after we moved away, I told my mom that it surprised me that she sold her childhood house, and she talked about all the bad memories that she had there that had replaced the good. And then she said, "Plus, Grampy started creeping me out towards the end." And it turns out he started telling her, "Your brother's still here. Every night, up and down those goddamn stairs. Up and down, up and down." He saw the, quote, bloody man, too. His son. But that's not the craziest part. About 7 to 8 years after selling the house, the guy that bought it saw my uncle in a gym and beelined it towards him, demanding to know what the hell is in that house. He, his wife, and 2 of his kids kept seeing Uncle around the house. I made it a point to walk by the house to try and catch someone coming out once I heard the gym story, and one day I caught the youngest son leaving. I introduced myself and asked him about what they saw, and he said he was too young at the time, but his mom, dad, and 2 brothers would always see my uncle behind them in mirrors in the house. They got rid of the mirrors and it stopped, he said. I don't quite understand that part because mirrors had nothing to do with it for me, but still, that's 3 people in my family, 3 friends, and 4 people of a different family that essentially saw the same thing or heard it. and I'd give anything to learn exactly what the heck went on in that house all those years. To put this in context, my school won a government grant where they could choose 25 of us to take on a trip to an abandoned village in Spain. We could miss 5 days of school, but there we had to do some simple restoration work for the village in exchange for our room and board. We cleaned the streets, painted some walls, helped in the kitchen, took care of some livestock. It was hard work, but we had a great time. The village is called Granadilla, in Càceres, in case anyone wants to check it out online, and the program was called Program for the Recovery and Educational Use of Abandoned Villages. And as a brief history of the town, it is located on the banks of a reservoir that flooded the town in the 1960s. The inhabitants who refused to leave drowned. Anecdotally, the old cemetery remains underwater today. The first night, the counselors who lived there during the camp took us to the new cemetery to tell us scary stories from the village. Ghosts, lovers who took their own lives in the old castle. We were all enchanted. Now, one of the counselors had even hidden behind the cemetery wall and would make noises and bang on the walls from time to time to scare us during the stories. Now, despite the scares, you could see everyone was having some fun. Suddenly, in the distance, a car appeared. It's a fairly inhospitable part of Spain, so the road had no streetlights. We only saw what our flashlights illuminated and, now, the headlights of that car. I remember the way the counselors looked at each other when they saw the car. Granadilla is far from any other town. There are no shops or houses nearby, and I think there was nothing for a 20-minute radius. That road only led to the town, and there were all of us who should have been there, 50 kids in total. Us in another school, 4 teachers, and 3 counselors from the town. So who was driving at midnight on that road that leads to nowhere? The car drove very, very slowly almost to where we were standing. We all thought it was a joke from our instructors, but the truth is they were acting pretty good about it because we didn't see them smile or even break their temperament at any point. And they looked at the car in surprise and tried to continue telling the story. The car stopped near us, turned around, and went back the way it had come, disappearing again in the distance. We continued to giggle, thinking it was just a little skit to scare us. Now, a few minutes later, the car appeared again, but this time followed by another car. Both were completely identical, white, those old-fashioned cars that look almost square, and both were driving extremely slowly, tailgating each other as if in a parade. I remember one of the chaperones signaling to another if he knew who they were. Both shook their heads. The cars did the same thing. They got very close to us, waited a few seconds, and then turned back the way they had come. Some of the kids started asking them who they were, clearly a little nervous. The monitor who was inside the graveyard came out too, looking at the spot where the cars had disappeared again. No one seemed to know anything, and our teachers also started asking them if there were people hanging around here. And then for the third time, the cars reappeared. Now there were 3 of them, again identical. They did the same thing. They drove slowly, one behind the other, but this time they parked in a small gravel area at the side of the cemetery about 50 meters away from us. They turned off the engines, opened the doors simultaneously, and this is where I started to get scared too. And 3 figures, about the same height and build, got out and just stood there, staring at us. I say staring at us because that's what it seemed like. The truth is, I never managed to see their faces or any actual human features. My teacher then started telling us to stand up, and we all started following the counselors back to the village. Our teachers watched our backs and asked us to stay calm. I walked beside one of the teachers, and I heard a counselor tell him, "This isn't our business anymore. That would be out of line with the kids." When we arrived at the village, the monitors closed the gate leading into Granadilla and asked us to remain calm. The village is walled, and the only access was that one which was already closed. Whoever the cars were, we were already out of their reach. I remember how scared some of my classmates were when they went to bed that day. A couple of them even cried next to their teachers, who assured them that it was definitely just some prank. However, no one seemed to believe this theory. But surely if it was a joke, it was a very nasty one. Still, we were able to enjoy the rest of the week without any more scares or strange people hanging around. In the village, no place had been built for the kids who went camping there to sleep, so we stayed in the old houses of the inhabitants. Those that had 2 rooms had been emptied to make room for 12 beds in each house for us, 6 beds in each dorm. And we had a great time, worked hard, and explored every corner of the place both day and night. We arranged fake weddings, snuck out to stargaze, and bothered the cattle at night. You know, the kind of things that 16-year-olds do when they have a town all to themselves for a week. And by the time we reached our last night there, we were all exhausted. Some had barely slept in a week with so much hustle and bustle, and the physical labor that we were doing during the day was clearly starting to take its toll on our spirits and bodies. So when we finished dinner that night, almost all of us kids went home. We know that some of them did stay and chat with the students from the other school, but around 1 a.m., the whole town was quiet. It was easy to hear anyone who had skipped bedtime because our room had a large window that we left open at night to let in the fresh air, and consequently, any noise from outside. Nothing could be heard outside that night, though. I couldn't sleep, which is something that happens to me a lot when I'm excited about something. I'd had a great time, so much so that I seemed to have forgotten about the car incident from that first night. I'd met some great people and I'd loved working in the village, so even though my colleagues were already asleep, I was still thinking about everything we'd done. And that's when I heard the door downstairs open. It's an old door, one of those heavy ones that drag on the wooden floor when opened. It's impossible to be discreet. I was surprised to hear it open because I hadn't heard anyone pass under our open window. I assumed they were our teachers trying to figure out if everyone was already in bed and resting, or trying to catch the guys who usually tried to sleep with their girlfriends while camp was going on. Now anyways, I was surprised because they had never come to our house. We had never made any fuss about it, and honestly, we were usually so tired that we turned off the lights pretty soon after dinner. Whoever was downstairs slowly started to climb the stairs to our room. On the landing, there were 2 doors facing each other, the one belonging to the girls from the other school and ours. The wood creaked beneath their feet as they walked very slowly. So slowly that it was strange, and I lifted my head from the pillow to see if any of my friends were also awake and listening to the same thing. However, they all seemed to be asleep. The person reached the first floor, the bedroom floor, and paused for a moment. And then they began walking slowly toward our room. The door we had was as old as the house itself, and it didn't fit properly with the frame, and because of this, there was a gap of about 5 centimeters between the bottom edge and the floor, through which light was leaking through. The person was acting so strange that I sat up in bed, trying to hear something. I looked at the doorway and saw 2 feet standing there. And the strange thing was that they were so close to the door that it seemed like the person behind it was leaning completely against the wood. I saw the handle move, though the door didn't open. It was as if someone with very little strength was trying to move it. I had unzipped my sleeping bag and was now sitting on the edge of the bed, trying not to touch the floor with my feet so as not to make a sound. I looked around again, but everyone was still asleep. The handle was still moving, but it was almost imperceptible. But me, I was scared to death. And then I stood up. At that exact moment, the wood creaked beneath my feet, and the person, or thing, I couldn't say exactly what it was, shot down the stairs. The strangest thing was the speed at which it did it, a sort of superhuman speed that made me shiver, and I remember going extremely cold and feeling paralyzed. Every step that thing took on the wood up the stairs and then down them sounded like it weighed 300 kilos, putting all its weight into each step. It seemed to have been running for its life going down those stairs due to the strange speed that to this day I still can't recreate. When the person reached the floor below, they slammed the door so hard it made the walls shake. I couldn't move. I just stood there, still in the same place that I was, just trembling with fear. The strange thing wasn't that someone had broken into our house. It could have been any kid, any teacher, maybe someone trying to play a trick on us. The point is that no kid or adult could have run that fast, making that much noise down those stairs, nor could anyone slam the door, which felt like it could have been heard all over town. And even though I waited a moment to try and listen through the window, no one seemed to be outside. I heard no footsteps on the gravel driveway, no laughter, no one entering the adjoining houses. I woke my classmates up crying and told them what had happened. Together, we went out in our pajamas to see if anyone was around the house or if we saw any lights on in any of the other kids' houses. Nothing. And we even went to our teacher's place to ask if it was them, but they were also in pajamas and very clearly sleepy. I don't know how many times I've told this story, how many times I've gotten goosebumps remembering it. I don't know what it was that entered our house in that village that night, but it wasn't human. Years later, Granadilla appeared on a famous Spanish television program about paranormal events called Cuarto Milenio. They talked about spirits, entities that still roam the houses in that old castle. So my girl and I encountered something very strange this weekend. So we trail run, and it's sort of become our thing. Now yesterday we found a trailhead that was up towards the mountains about 2 hours away from Seattle, pretty remote. So we left early and got to the trailhead at 8 a.m. The trail was particularly difficult, steep enough that we found ourselves walking pretty often, and in retrospect we should have been surprised by what we saw next. Midway through our run on a steep descent, we pass a lone hiker and think absolutely nothing about the encounter. Alone, maybe 65 to 70 and wearing all white. The clothes were modern, looked perfectly placed for today. Hiking pants, vest, hat, and she had one hiking pole and a backpack, all white. Again, modern clothes didn't stand out as strange, and we say hello and she says nothing back. We were running, so there was really nothing rude about it, and we just simply passed her. We continue, and it gets harder but progress nearly 3 miles uphill, and we get to a point where the trail becomes an overgrown forest road in a small clearing, and at this point the road begins to get very, very overgrown. So we crest a small ridge and suddenly we see a hiker. It's been 30 minutes since we saw the older lady in white, yet here was a hiker with the same outfit. There were no folks in our trail, yet we'd swear that this was the same person. But that would be impossible, right? And the gravity of this didn't quite hit yet. So strangely, we ran past her again. We ran a couple of feet in front, at least, because at this point the road was entirely bushes and not passable, and so we turn around. So we walk past her a last time, and she says something like, "Seems like the trail ends here." It didn't feel eerie, yet in retrospect it was eerie. We ran back, and everything seemed normal until we reflected on why this lady was there. How could she have even made it there at all? We just ran 5 miles uphill, steep terrain, and so did this 70-year-old lady. It's been a one-way path, and there had been no other turns. The trail we were on at this point was completely overgrown, enough that we had to turn around, and why was she there? How did she get there? Was she the same lady? And when we turned around and ran back that same trail, we never ran into the first hiker. When I was around 10 years old, my dog fled and disappeared. It had happened before, so we did the same as the other times. Paid some radio announcements to spread the word and glued some pamphlets around, and nothing worked. Until one day my father mysteriously said, "We're gonna go get Frodo back." Now this was before the Lord of the Rings movies, mind you, and both him and my older brother were big fans of the books. And we drove through a weird rocky road which was far from home and actually found Frodo waiting for us by the gates of a house. No one greeted us. My father opened the gate and the dog got in the car with us. Now 20 years later, he finally mustered the courage to tell us what had happened. He's a physician and had an appointment with a patient, and the patient got in and said, "You look distressed. What happened?" And my father replied, Our dog ran away, and my youngest son is very sad about it." And the man then asked for a piece of paper and a pencil, and he drew a map and said, "This is where your dog is." And we followed the map and found Frodo. And not a matter of belief, as Frodo was the living proof of that man's abilities. And that was also a very special evening when my father told us what had happened. It was a family gathering, and my godfather said, "Yep, that's it. Some people just have those amazing abilities." To which my mother replied, "Of course, just like Julian," which is me. And everyone stared at me, and my godfather asked if it was true, and I just gathered strength and said something which I'd never shared in their company because it kind of made me embarrassed, as I always saw my family as rational materialists. "Yes," I replied, and proceeded to telling them all sorts of weird things that I've kept to myself, such as seeing ghosts when I was younger. My godfather got up and went inside the house. In a gesture of unbelievable kindness, he came back with a rare bottle of Portuguese wine that he was keeping for a special occasion with chalices for all of us. He served us the wine, raised his glass in a toast, and said, "To Julian, for the courage of sharing with us something special today." And this is one of the sweetest memories ever. I'm blessed with an amazing family, and I'm well aware of that. So I've been sitting on this for a while. I haven't told anyone about this because it sounds freaking crazy, but it stuck with me for a few months and I just need to get it out. If anyone else has experienced something like this in Texas, especially Central Texas, I'd really like to hear about it. So way back in September, I was going through some pretty severe depression, and I was thinking about taking my own life. Now I came up with a plan which was to actually jump off a water tower, and when the time came, I snuck out of the house at around 1 a.m. and began my 25 to 30-minute walk to the tower. Now, my original plan was to climb the water tower, but when I got there, I noticed a radio tower pretty close by and thought, yeah, this one's going to take me out for sure. Now, to get to the tower, I would have to cross this field with an abandoned building off to the side, and it looked like it was made out of a shipping container. Now, I wasn't really focused on the building, just heading toward the tower, but that's when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. On the far side of the building, something was peeking around the corner, just the upper half of its body. I only saw it for a split second, but it was tall, at least 8 feet, completely white, and not shaped like any animal I've ever seen before. It was fast. As soon as it realized that I'd noticed it, it turned and bolted. And the speed it moved with wasn't normal. It was almost like it wasn't bound by the same laws of physics. Like it was too big to be that fast, too smooth in the way that it moved. It was almost too uncanny. Now, I also want to point out, because this was an important detail that I left out, that I did hear the grass rustle when it ran off. As if seeing this thing wasn't scary enough, just hearing the grass rustle for a moment made the experience that much more terrifying. And this could have been an auditory or visual hallucination, but I have no concrete answer. Now, I just want to clarify to everyone that I have never been much of a spiritual or religious person up till that point. I have always followed logic and reasoning, so when I saw that creature, I immediately began thinking of reasonable explanations. And at first I thought, was that a cow? Because I heard mooing in the fields earlier, and so I assumed that that's what I saw and it probably had to be a cow. So when I got far enough to see the area around the building, I saw that the cows were all fenced off and they were far away, and there was nothing else around. And I mean, there's no way that a cow could stand on its legs like that and move at the speed it did. What really messed me up wasn't just the sight of it, it was how I felt. The wave of dread that hit me was overwhelming, not like normal fear. It felt primal, like something inside me knew that I had to get out of there immediately. And here's the weirdest part. I went there, planning to die. But after seeing that thing, I didn't want to die anymore. I was absolutely freaking terrified, and I've never seen something like this before in my life. I don't have any history of hallucinations, and I wasn't under the influence of any drugs, and what I saw was absolutely real. And I'm not saying it was paranormal, I don't know, but it was real, and real enough that it made me turn around and leave when I thought that I was ready to die. And if anyone else has seen something like this, especially near towers or isolated areas in Texas, please sound off in the comments. So I got to work this morning and began unloading and loading cargo into the back of my truck. It's very dark in my workspace, and so much so that I have to wear a headlamp to read labels in the loading area because the lights are not very bright in my workspace, and it gets bright during the day, and it's very silent, and I'm the only person who starts here at 4 a.m. Now this morning, at roughly 4:15, I stopped loading my cargo and sent my boss a quick text message, and something literally loudly hissed in my ear and actually felt warm air on my neck. I freaked out and probably looked ridiculous if the security cameras caught it because I was backing up quickly and spinning in circles trying to see whatever it was. I flinched so hard that I gave myself slight whiplash, and then I immediately ran outside to my car and waited for my coworker to come in about an hour later so I wouldn't be alone. And I debated leaving work. I'm on my lunch break now posting this, and when my coworker saw me outside when he arrived, I just told him that I'm sick and needed to come outside for a few minutes. And I'm totally freaked out, and I don't want to come back into work for tomorrow. I've been in the area at 4 a.m. over 1,000 times, so I am very used to the norm, and this was the first experience like this that I've ever had. Now, for some context, I drive a 5-ton truck for a third-party logistics company at a large factory with over 5,000 workers. Part of my job requires me to be the first person on site every day at the logistics area to have materials delivered before the factory workers' shifts start at 7 a.m. Other people usually start showing up at around 6:30, and I arrive at 4 a.m. every morning to load and unload my own trailer in a dedicated caged-in area that only I work in, as I'm the only driver here for this company. Only me and 2 other coworkers have access cards for this area. I won't name the company or factory that I work in because I don't want it to affect my job. The black square drawn in the image is just covering a company logo. There's nothing paranormal that I can see in the photo, it's just to show what the place looks like. Yes, workers have died in this building from machinery mishaps in the past, and it's been operating for over 50 years. I've had numerous paranormal experiences, but never any at work. When I was 16, my sister and I were walking home for lunch a half block from the high school. A girl in my younger sister's class was driving someone's car in the parking lot doing donuts. It appeared the girl in the front passenger seat was scared and wanted out, and the door opened and she was pulled under the car. The driver must have thought that she was still on top of her, ended up backing over her for a second time, and I knew she was dead. And then I saw what looked like refractive light combined with a mist or fog, and this was the best that I can use words to describe it really, that sort of ascended up just above the car, and then it was gone. My sister ran down to call 911. Now, I was dry heaving in the ditch as I was extremely sensitive to other people's pain, so witnessing a person ran over twice and be gone was overwhelming. I wondered about what I saw a few times that summer, never told anyone, and didn't think that I'd be believed. It was a long faded memory by the time I was in my late 20s. My BFF was driving my car to drop me at SeaTac for a business trip on the old Highway 99 viaduct. We came up on an accident that had just occurred, motorcycle versus SUV. The SUV was on its side, wheels facing the bay, and a woman was having a panic attack, and another woman was kneeling by the motorcyclist, reaching for a pulse. I saw the same refracted light and foggy but transparent particles move up and away from him, and then disappeared just as the woman sunk her head down, and I interpreted that as no pulse. What could it possibly be but a soul or a quantum group of particles from the elements of a supernova that gave us life, returning to the fold? This isn't the only experience I've had that didn't have an explanation based on our current understanding of quantum physics, chemistry, biology, any of the sciences. But it's one I have witnessed twice under similar circumstances, so it would be difficult to explain it away as a reflection of some light bouncing off of metal or other anomalies. Firstly, I don't want to convince anyone that I really have this skill. My objective is to report and answer questions from people who are really interested or curious about the subject. In parapsychology, telepathy is the ability to acquire information about another person's thoughts, feelings, or activities without using verbal, body, sign, or written language. I discovered this skill when I was 7 years old when I went to try a cinnamon candy with a friend. We bought it at the supermarket and we each ate one, and I loved the taste, but I heard my friend say, "Wow, it's really bad." So I replied, "No, it's really good." And he looked at me scared and said, "How did you know I didn't like it? I didn't say that, I just thought it." And at the time I didn't understand, and he was somewhat intrigued and spat out the candy and went home. And after that, I noticed that when talking to friends, I would hear a certain voice coming from them when they were about to say something. I always spoke before they spoke, and they were surprised, but soon they started to treat me badly, and they called me boring and weird and stopped talking to me. And to continue having friends, I stopped sharing what I heard and didn't talk about it with anyone anymore. As a teenager, I managed to meet and have relationships with many girls. My friends who didn't know didn't understand how I managed to date so many girls, and I jokingly said, "When you know what the other person is thinking, it's easy." And they always laughed. The voice I hear doesn't always have the same voice as the person. Sometimes it's just the person's intention or feeling at that moment, but sometimes it's the same as the person's voice, and it depends on how they represent their conscious thoughts. During my life, I told a few people about this ability, and when I did, I had to prove it by talking about something she was thinking, and even then the vast majority didn't believe it and thought it was some mentalism or a magic trick. As an adult, I decided to use this skill to help people. I chose to be a psychologist. Obviously, I do very well during the sessions, and my patients praise my work a lot as I know exactly what they are feeling and thinking. So this is a pretty incredible story. My nephew is apparently the reincarnation of the first pilot to break the sound barrier. First of all, he doesn't have access to the internet or TV, and the only thing he watches are cartoon channels. Charles Yeager died on December 7th, 2020, and my nephew was born a few days later premature. It all started when my nephew started telling my sister this memory from his past life that he was a pilot and that one day his plane crashed over mountains, but he didn't die. And he also said his name was Yeager and occasionally referred to a Charles, but we didn't make the correlation right away because the pilot also nicknamed himself Chuck Yeager. I don't have all the info, but I'll do an update later, and my mother has to tell me everything in detail, but in short, my nephew has information he can't possibly know, such as the types of planes Yeager flew, etc. And now we're going to ask him about Charles Yeager's brothers, sisters, and sons, and information that only he could have. But what would you do then, if you were us, if it turned out to be true? Because I myself still find it hard to believe, but what should we do? Contact his family? "Hello, just so you know, your father has been reincarnated in France. Here's the information that only you could have known, which proves it. He's fine and loves Paw Patrol." Back in April of 2014, me and my mate Paul drove up to Loch Aber in Scotland for a fishing weekend. We'd known each other since primary school, so we were very close friends. But once we each started working full-time jobs, getting married, and having kids, opportunities to hang out got fewer and further between. That was around 2009/2010, and it was also around then that Paul invited me fishing for the first time. But little did I know, the decision would kick off a chain of events that'd lead to one of the single most terrifying, confusing, and ultimately haunting events of my entire life. I didn't even know Paul was into fishing when he first invited me, but after joining him that first time, I instantly understood what it did for him. He worked 9 to 5 all week, drove home to wrestle the kids into bed, and while that second part was a joy beyond words, the whole young parent lifestyle could leave you really burned out in need of rest. Back in my early 20s, the idea of just sitting on a riverbank doing absolutely nothing all afternoon wasn't in the least bit appealing. But at a stage in my life when it was either chaos at work or chaos at home, an afternoon's fishing turned out to be pure bliss. Cut to about 4 years later, and we're driving up to this private loch in Scotland that we'd gotten permission to do some fishing at. A friend of a friend's dad had a membership, so we just had to drop his name if anyone showed up, and we'd be grand. And permission was especially important since we were planning on camping there for 2 nights. It wasn't our first camping trip like that. We'd been on about a dozen of them by then, so we'd long since graduated from bare-bones survival to bringing all kinds of gadgets to make us safer and more comfortable. We had stuff like the jet boil, which made making tea and coffee a bunch easier, and we also had portable charging banks for our phones and portable speaker. But then that year, Paul had brought along a little surprise for me. We just set up camp when he pulls out 2 small walkie-talkies in a waterproof bag. He had them all charged up, and since they cost him a few quid, the batteries were supposed to last a whole week, meaning that we'd be well covered for just a weekend. He brought them to save our phone's batteries, which we usually burn through quite quickly, since we were always playing music or showing each other daft videos or what have you. Then, combined with the amount of battery texting and calling each other burned, the radios seemed like a pretty solid investment. You might think a weekend of fishing involved a lot of sitting, eating, and sleeping side by side, and it did. But every so often, one of us would wander off to collect firewood, fetch something from camp, or go looking for fresh bait. Firewood and bait could take a while to muster up, so having the radios wasn't just useful, they were really entertaining too. Now, for example, I'd be off collecting firewood, and Paul would announce something over the radio like, "Zulu, 5er 9er, this is Oscar Kilo Charlie. You're a bellend and your mom's a slag. Over." I'd inevitably fire back with, "Copy that, but can confirm she wouldn't touch you with a pooey stick. Over." Or something to that effect, and then back and forth we'd go taking the piss out of each other military style. And we'd have little exchanges like that whenever we were separated for any reason, including on the Saturday afternoon when I made a 6-mile round trip on foot to pick up a lighter. Since both of our lighters decided to stop working within half an hour of one another, and since me and Paul had already had a couple of cans of lager each, I volunteered to walk while Paul stayed behind to keep an eye on our gear. We kept in touch on the radios as long as we could, but seemed to hit the distance limit around the 2-mile mark thanks to the hills I had to walk over to make it to the small country news agents. I arrived, bought a few disposable lighters along with a few other bits and bobs, then I started walking the 3 miles back to where we were camped. Every so often I'd test the radio to see if Paul could hear me out or not. It stayed quiet for the first mile or so. Then once I'd climbed the hills, I'd started to pick up a little bit of static here and there, just not enough to properly communicate. I kept on testing every other minute, wondering why I'd seemed to get more range on the way out than I had coming back, when suddenly, my radio crackled back to life. It's hard to hear what was being said at first, and I kept trying to tell Paul that I couldn't hear him properly, but it didn't seem like it could hear me either. I kept on walking for a bit, keeping my radio on and waiting for Paul's voice to finally start breaking through the static. But when it did, something sounded very, very wrong. When I first heard a kind of metallic whining sound coming from my radio, I initially thought that it was some kind of interference. I had turned the thing on and off again, hoping that that might fix things, but the second I switched it back on, it was much louder and much clearer than before. It wasn't interference, it was Paul, and it sounded like he was crying. It wasn't crying like wailing crying, it was those soft whimpers and sobs, and they'd come in stops and starts, Almost like every so often Paul was holding down the transmission button and then just crying into his radio. Obviously, my first question was something like, "Are you alright, mate?" And I thought that he might have gotten some bad news by text message or something, and people only cry like that when someone's died or something equally serious has happened. I kept asking him what had happened as I sped up my walking pace, but since he wouldn't respond, I could only assume that he couldn't hear me, most likely because the radios weren't as reliable as we first thought. I kept walking, much faster than I had before, while still trying to get Paul to talk to me, and then suddenly I hear him start to speak. I remember saying something like, "Oh, thank God," thinking that he might finally be able to hear me. But then instead of saying anything that made sense, he still sounded like he was crying as he started saying, Lydia, I'm so sorry." And I respond, Who the fuck is Lydia, mate? What's going on?" Again, he didn't seem to hear me. He just kept on crying, whimpering and repeating that name. But then he'd never mentioned any girl named Lydia before, and it certainly wasn't his girlfriend or his kid's name. So why was he saying it? I started to jog by the time he started getting louder, crying out, "I'm so sorry, Lydia. Please forgive me." While every so often I'd pant breathless things into the radio like, "I'm on my way. Hang in there. Hey, whatever it is, we're gonna get it sorted, all right?" But I didn't know anything of the sort, and to be honest, I was terrified. I'd never known Paul to cry like that before, ever. Even when we were in primary school and he nearly split his head open falling off of a rope swing, he held back tears like his life depended on it. So to hear him properly sobbing into that radio like that, it put the fear of God into me. Whatever had happened, it was bad, and in all likelihood, I wouldn't be able to do anything about it except let him drink himself into a stupor as we drove back to Manchester to deal with whatever it was. And once I was within a few minutes' walk of our campsite, I kept saying, "Nearly there, mate, nearly there," into the radio. Since I was only a few hundred meters away, I really did think that I'd get a response, as the radios had previously been working fine at those distances. But instead of a solid response, I heard a scream. At first, Paul started shouting, Lydia, please forgive me," and it was so loud that all the distortion came back. Then, before the radio finally went quiet, I heard this horrible, protracted electronic scream before a sudden and terrifying silence. And I ran like hell, sprinting down the dirt track near the private lock's entrance and then continuing all the way until I got back to camp. But when I arrived, there was no signs of Paul anywhere. I looked around, catching my breath so I could let out a roar of, "Paul, where are you?" But there was no response. I cried out again and then again, running from the campsite to the spot near the lock where we were fishing, shouting out his name the whole time. He wasn't at the lock either, which prompted another wild scream of, "Paul, where are you?" Then out of the blue, I heard him. "What?" he called out in response, walking out of the trees to my left with a load of firewood under his arm. He sounded mildly irritated, like he was wondering what the big deal was, and when I saw him, he looked fine. He didn't look like he'd been crying at all. He didn't seem in the least bit agitated by anything. So, to him, I was the only one who suddenly started acting all weird, not the other way around. I remember immediately recognizing that something was off, but the first place my mind went was prank. I thought Paul had probably gotten tired of assuming the cadence of an air traffic controller to insult me over the radio, and had instead resorted to scaring the living crap out of me with his newfound talent for voice acting. It seemed obvious, but after I basically stared at him in confusion for a moment and asked, "Is this a joke?" he responded with a mostly convincing no. And I say mostly convincing because it wasn't like he didn't have a history of performing some very convincing act-outs in the name of a prank. So I was half expecting him to go from straight-faced and serious to laughing in my face while yelling, "Gotcha." But he didn't. He simply gave me a look of confusion and started asking me what was wrong. In hindsight, I totally understand his confusion. There I was, all red in the face, barely able to get my words out after having been screaming at him. And then when I finally did catch up to him, all I had to ask is this a prank? He'd had his radio on him the entire time, but said that he hadn't heard a thing. The radio had gone silent after he lost connection on my journey to the shop, and he hadn't heard anything else from me until I was standing there in front of him, sweating buckets after running in all my hiking gear. But then, once I caught my breath, and the relief that he was okay had washed over me, I started telling him what I'd heard over the radio. I remember telling him how I'd heard him crying, and he was obviously like, "I haven't been crying. What are you on about?" So we agreed that I'd heard someone crying and saying sorry, it just couldn't have been him. But then I got to the name and his expression changed completely. I told him the person had been saying sorry to a girl named Lydia. And by then it was making sense that it wasn't Paul on the radio because, as I said, he didn't know anyone called Lydia. But then the second I mentioned that name, his face dropped enough for me to be like, "Wait, do you know Lydia?" Paul didn't look scared or angry or anything like that, just sort of confused, really confused. His brow furrowed, his eyes narrowed, and then it looked like he was struggling to find the right words for a second before he asked me, "I haven't told you, have I?" I asked him to elaborate. Then again, Paul took a moment to collect his thoughts before he asked, "Have you been snooping through my phone?" And I hadn't, and I told him that, and then basically demanded he tell me what was going on. I'd gone from terrified to confused and fairly chill, then right back up towards terror again when I realized the name Lydia was of some significance to him, and obviously in relation to the terrifying experience I had on my way back. And I think I tried to phrase the question about 3 different ways before I finally asked, "Who the F is Lydia, Paul?" Paul looked like he was about to explain, and then cut himself off abruptly to ask, "How the fuck do you know?" And I exploded, saying, "No what? I heard someone say Lydia. I thought it was you, that's all I know. You obviously know more than me, just fucking tell me." It looked like he was going to scream back at me for a second, and then cut himself off again, collected his thoughts, and then started to speak as calmly as he could. In so many words, he explained that literally only 2 people in the world knew what he was about to tell me, and that was how his girlfriend had just found out she was pregnant, literally only a week or so before the fishing trip. They hadn't been planning for a pregnancy, but they decided that they wanted to keep it and had even gone so far as to brainstorm baby names. Paul said he wasn't very imaginative or too fussed when it came to names. Their routine was that his girlfriend would suggest one and he'd just give it either a yes or a no or a maybe. If it was a boy, Max was very high on the yes list, but if it was going to be a girl, both Paul and his girlfriend agreed that a very beautiful name would be Lydia. In the moments after he repeated that name, it was my turn to stand there in a confused stupor for a few seconds. I responded, "Are you joking? Is this definitely not a prank?" And he swore on his kid's life that he hadn't faked any crying. He hadn't heard me trying to talk to him on the radio, and that he wasn't joking about his girlfriend being pregnant. We were both wrestling with 100 questions each, with Paul taking a turn to make me swear that I hadn't talked to his girlfriend and that I hadn't gone through his phone. I swore blind that I hadn't done anything of the sort. I'd just heard someone using the name Lydia on the radio somehow, before stating what I'd heard was so terrifying because it sounded almost exactly like him. Not so much the crying, but in the way the voice said, "I'm so sorry, Lydia, please forgive me." And what followed were probably some of the most surreal moments of our entire lives. Once we'd accepted that each of us was telling the truth, it didn't matter which way we cut it. Something really, really weird was going on, and both of us were starting to get quite agitated. The only thing we could properly agree on was the idea that somehow I picked up a transmission from someone close by, and in doing so had been responding to that transmission frequency and not the one that Paul's radio was tuned to. That's why Paul couldn't hear me, and the reason why the man shouting about a girl named Lydia couldn't hear me is because he wasn't listening. We were still a bit nervy about the whole thing, but in the end, we decided that it had to be some kind of wild coincidence that Lydia just so happened to be a potential name for Paul's unborn baby. It still left the question of what the hell happened to make that guy cry and scream into a radio like that, but we talked ourselves down from ideas that something paranormal had happened. And we spent the night talking the whole thing out, and as the hours passed, we managed to successfully convince ourselves whatever happened, there was a perfectly logical explanation for it. And that explanation was chilling all on its own because I might have just listened to someone's complete mental breakdown, potentially before they'd done something terrible, hence the scream. But it was a logical one all the same. When we got back home, what happened to us became a bit of a campfire story. We'd retell it with a smile, wowing our mates and the guys down at the pub with a tale of some of them inevitably claiming was a load of bollocks. But those that knew us, really knew us, knew otherwise. We weren't the kind of lads to make something up like that, and the fact we weren't like it was defo ghost lads made us all the more credible. We knew that there had to be a reasonable explanation, even if that explanation did sort of stretch that word logic to a degree. And for at least a time, the incident was nothing more than a curiosity, something which made for a fun little story for us to tell. But then, as the months went by, and I had time to let my mind wander on the subject, I started having some very uncomfortable thoughts. I know it's not possible for radio transmissions to travel backwards in time. I've looked it up about 100 times in 100 different places, and they've all given me roughly the same answer. Theoretically, if you read up on wormholes and tachyons and all that other complicated physics stuff, then yeah, on paper it is possible for a radio transmission, or alternatively, the signature of a phone call, to travel backwards in time. I suppose some of you might be confused as to why I'm talking about tachyons all of a sudden, so I'll just go ahead and explain what I mean. My biggest, and you might say my most irrational fear concerning what I heard that day, is that I somehow heard something that either happens in the future, or at least had the potential to happen. Something terrible involving Paul and his future daughter, Lydia. That did come to pass, by the way. Paul and his girlfriend had a baby girl in January of 2015, and she turned 10 years old last month as the time of writing this in February of 2025. It sounds a bit horrible, but when I found out it was a girl and that they were going to call her Lydia, an actual chill went through me. I told myself that I was overthinking things, that they'd have a boy or a girl not named Lydia, and that the whole thing would be something that I just looked back on and laugh at. But hearing that it had actually happened, I had to pretend to be nothing but happy for him when, really, I was starting to get more and more concerned that something terrible was destined to happen. And for the last 10 years or so, it turned into something I've worried about at an almost daily basis. And I'm glad to say the older Lydia gets, the less anxious I feel, but there's still a small part of me that wonders if something awful is doomed to happen at some point in the near or distant future. I had one guy online suggest to me that maybe what I'd heard was something that only had the potential to happen, and by some kind of weird intervention or awareness, it hasn't, and we've successfully avoided it. And I hope that's true. I hope I've just hideously overthought what amounts to a bizarre coincidence, but the alternative is so frightening that I can only barely bring myself to think about it. I used to do a lot of hiking and camping in my youth, especially with my family as a child. But after I moved to San Francisco for college in 1989, finding hiking partners proved much easier said than done. Don't get me wrong, I met a few people that I really got along with, and some of them I remained friends with well after we graduated. But with weekends mostly reserved for partying and with campus life being pretty busy in general, sometimes I'd wake up on a Saturday morning to find that everyone had pulled out of a trip that we'd been planning for weeks. I remember being very disappointed, but I didn't stop and cry and stop inviting people. Instead, I just headed out on my own at times when I really needed to de-stress. The first couple of times didn't feel as fun with company, but then after a while I started to really appreciate the peace and quiet of being alone on the trails. They'd be fairly occupied on weekends, of course, but sometimes I'd head out on weekdays too, days when I was so isolated it felt like I was the last person on Earth. I got kind of addicted to that feeling, I guess, the peace of being completely at peace. College felt so people-oriented at times that it really drained my social battery, so heading out into the woods whenever I got the chance felt just as restorative as it was relaxing. But it was only once I started visiting the Redwood State Parks that my hiking obsession got kicked into overdrive, because for the very first time in my life, I came face to face with a coastal redwood. Imagine standing at the base of a tree so tall that you can't see the top without tilting your head way, way back. A tree so enormous that when you're standing among a bunch of them for the first time, it kind of feels like you've shrunk by a couple of feet. Well, that's the coastal redwood, the tallest living thing on planet Earth. Most of them are between 300 to 350 feet tall, and their trunks can grow just over 20 feet wide. So I'm not exaggerating at all when I say that they are mind-blowingly gigantic. They're old too, ancient even, with some scientists estimating that the oldest in California have been standing tall for over 2,000 years. Hiking among them sometimes feels like you're on another planet, like it really is a truly surreal experience for folks like me who didn't grow up with them on their doorstep. It got to the point where I'd head up to the forest surrounding Mendocino at least 3 or 4 times a month. Whenever possible, I'd drive up on the Friday, spend a night or two on the trails, and then head back to San Francisco in time for classes on Monday. And while I definitely couldn't stick to that kind of schedule during my final year in post-grad job hunting, heading out to the Redwoods became my go-to choice of exercise and spiritual cure-all. By the time I was in my late 20s, I must have been to Del Norte Coast, Jedediah Smith, and Prairie Creek State Parks about 100 times apiece. And while I didn't quite know them like the back of my hand, I knew them well enough to walk among the towering redwood trunks with the utmost confidence. I was an experienced hiker and camper. I could take care of myself out in the boonies, and I also figured that I'd seen just about everything the woods had to throw at me. But then, on a weekend-long hike in 1996, I was proven incorrect on that last point in spectacular and terrifying fashion. And so by the summer of '96, I'd been hiking around the woods in Mendocino County for coming up on 6 years. Then after a chance meeting with a local homeowner while out in the trails, he gave me permission to park my car outside his house for safekeeping. His home was among a collection of simple country homes right next to where the Willets and Three Chop roads intersect on the Noyo River, and this meant that I was able to park up there and then have almost direct access to the deep woods from my tiny island of civilization among the endless sea of redwoods. And when I say deep woods, I'm talking about just as deep as you can possibly get. Sometimes I'd be more than 3 or 4 miles from the nearest marked trail and up to 20 miles from the nearest highway. Hiking alone in those kinds of areas can be risky because if you get hurt, getting help can be very, very difficult. But I'd also reached the point where if I wasn't pushing the envelope in some way, if I didn't feel completely and utterly isolated and alone, then I wasn't satisfied. And the same could be said for the exercise aspect, that I was just training harder and harder, but there was definitely a spiritual aspect to it too, and I kind of relied on it to keep me from getting too stressed in my professional life. So that summer of 1996, late June to be exact, I set off from my buddy's place on a route that I must have hiked half a dozen times before. For the first part of the journey, my route took me past a couple of campgrounds and trailheads, but after about mile 10, it was all untouched forest. I used to think that with how isolated I was walking on ground that hadn't been touched for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. There were places that not even the native Namlaki tribes people had used for hunting or burial grounds, ageless and primordial. But therein lay the thrill. I'd usually make it to about mile 15 before I ran out of steam. But in June of 1996, I managed to push myself a whole 18 miles into the deep woods before I finally tapped out. Granted, I'd started extra early that day, but I've been wanting to advance into untouched territory for quite some time, so it felt great to break what I guess I would call my personal best. I made camp, ate a little food, then after a quick hygiene routine, completed with some eternally handy wet wipes, I had a smoke and then hit the hay. The next morning, after I ate a few power bars for breakfast, I decided to pack up my tent and head back in the direction of my car. The extra miles were well worth it, but it still meant that I had one hell of a hike ahead of me if I wanted to get home before it was too late to order takeout. I walked for about 4 or 5 hours, stopped for a quick lunch, and then got back on the move again as quickly as I could. I was trying to cover as much ground as possible while staying on the right bearings, so I think I was mostly either looking at the ground right up ahead of me or at my compass. But then at one point, I looked up for no particular reason to see something that, in all my years of hiking, I'd never seen before. Despite the name, it's not just redwoods that grow out in the Redwood State Parks. You see trees like Douglas firs, western hemlocks, spruce trees, and, as I saw in the woods that day, collections of tanbark oaks, or tan oaks for short. There was about 5 or 6 of them, all leaning at angles of between 60 to 80 degrees, and while that's not entirely unusual in a place with a lot of dense growth, what immediately drew my attention was how they all seemed to be leaning toward each other. They looked like the frame of some giant ancient teepee, something a bunch of similarly minded hikers had started to put together before abandoning. Then, as I looked up, I saw that all of their foliage was bunched up and intertwined, forming a great impermeable mass of leaves and branches. As I said, I'd never seen anything like it before, so after stopping me dead in my tracks, I just kind of stared at it for a moment or two, wondering what the hell I was looking at. The first explanation that popped into my head was that it was some kind of nest or den, because it didn't look remotely human in construction. But I couldn't know for certain until I took a closer look, so that's what I did. With the woods being calm and quiet, I figured the den thing was empty and uninhabited, but as I started walking closer at a very casual walk, I heard something which stopped me in my tracks. It came from the nest thing, that much was clear. The dense green mass of leaves and twisted branches which, by then, was almost 30 meters directly above my head. It sounded like someone hitting a stick against some sort of hollow tube, like a tud, 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 but really loud with that echoey hollow sound to it. I froze, looking right up at the mass of foliage above my head, feeling the hairs on my arms and neck begin to stand on end as I realized something was inside of it. I figured the only thing large enough to make a sound like that would be a bear. I mean, I had zero clue what the hell was going on, but as I tried my best to figure it out, that's where my thoughts landed. Some very talented black bears have gotten up there and had somehow made a den where the branches of 5 or 6 trees just so happened to have converged. Then, if she was somehow finding a way to make the noise by wrapping her claws against something, then she was surely doing so as a warning to stay away from herself and her cubs. I didn't move a muscle for a minute or so after I'd first heard the noise. Then, when maybe 20 or 30 seconds of silence had passed and the noise didn't repeat, I started slowly backing up, keeping my eyes locked on the mass of foliage for any movement. I'd taken about 3 slow steps backwards when I'd heard the noise again. It was softer that time, without so many tud-tuds, but it was 100% coming from the nest thing that I had my eyes glued to. I didn't run. I knew better than to turn my back and bolt. If whatever was in that nest wasn't a black bear, and it had chase instincts, running would probably trigger them. And that's why I didn't run, why I couldn't just run, and why I watched that thing unblinkingly until I was at least 40 to 50 meters away. Only then did I turn my back and walk a little more briskly. But every 2 or 3 seconds, I'd fire a look over my shoulder just in case anything had climbed down from the nest and happened to be following me. Nothing climbed out of it, and I didn't hear any more of that eerie knocking sound either, but as I was walking away, I heard a different kind of sound that had me spinning around in fearful anticipation. At first, it sounded like old bark stretching and snapping, kind of like what you hear before a tree falls, I suppose. And then at the same time, I started to hear a bunch of rustling up high, and I was pretty curious it was coming from up near that nest thing. I turned around on the spot, half expecting to see that black bear mama running at me through the trees. But again, I saw something that I'll never, ever be able to fully explain. The tan barks, the leaning ones, they were moving. They didn't all move at once. They took turns rising up out of the dirt, like some fairy-tale giant was plucking them out of the ground one by one. Then no sooner did they rise up into the air, exposing long tendrils of roots as they did, but they were slowly lowered back down to the ground with a soft whisper of compressed soil. I genuinely couldn't believe what I was seeing. My brain just couldn't make sense of it for a few moments, and I honestly wondered if I was beginning to lose my mind. When I tried to blink the moving trees away, I felt like a character in a goddamned cartoon or something, yet it was the only thing I could think of to try and stop it. But it didn't work. The movements didn't stop, and instead, they only got stranger. The tan oaks, which had been leaning at a slight angle, began to bend unnaturally, flexing on indiscernible joints as the great mass of foliage that they were connected with began to slowly descend. The trees then started to move again, rising and falling with a kind of quiet that didn't seem possible, and as they did, they dragged the amassed canopy above it with a sustained rustling that sounded like the trees themselves were whispering to one another. Then finally, in a moment of near madness, I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't 5 or 6 trees. It was one single living thing, and they weren't tree trunks I was looking at moving quietly up and down. They were its legs. I remember the confusion and disorientation keeping me glued to the spot for I honestly don't know how long, but it couldn't have been more than a second or two. Then, as it clicked in my head that I was looking at a body and legs, I turned and ran as fast as my own could carry me. It was blind panic, the only time in my life I've ever truly experienced that kind of terror. This total, full-body sensation of, if I don't move fast enough, I'm going to die. But I also experienced the most profoundly intense adrenaline rush I have ever experienced. Running with a heavy pack through the forest was a brutal, exhausting grind. My pack had to be 40 or 50 pounds, with the straps digging into my shoulders and chafing with every step. The uneven ground messed with me too. Roots snagged at my feet, rocks shifted under my weight, and low branches whipped at my face. But I was so completely terrified of what I'd seen that I must have run half a mile before I even thought about stopping. My pack had never felt lighter. My legs were burning. My pack bounced in a way that threw me off my rhythm every so often, which combined with the uneven ground meant that I took a couple of nasty spills before scrambling to my feet and running again, through the trees, under branches, the world a blur of green and brown as the hurt slowly sank deeper into my legs. My calves started to cramp up, my lower back knotted up like someone was twisting a knife into it. But still I ran, and I didn't stop until my stomach started to twist as my chest heaved and my vision tunneled. Finally, after what seemed like much longer but was only probably about 3 or 4 minutes, my body finally decided no more. My legs started to wobble, feeling heavier and heavier with each step before a feeling of nausea surged upward. I stumbled to a stop, hands on my knees, and began heaving until I puked. My head was spinning, spit and vomit dangled from my mouth as I gasped for air, all with my pack still weighing down on me from above. The second my stomach felt empty and the retching stopped, I turned and saw that, except for the trees, the woods behind me were empty. The relief was intense, washing over me like a wave of calm, but I didn't quite relax until I'd made it all the way back to my car. I didn't see the people who let me park in their driveway. It was almost 9 p.m. by the time I made it back, and I was in no mood to talk to anyone after walking for miles upon miles with my head on a swivel. I drove home in almost complete silence, just some talk radio to try and keep my mind off of what I'd just been through. Then after I got home and showered, I got to thinking, which quickly turned to drinking. I knew no one would believe a single goddamned word of what I'd seen, but that's not what bothered me. What truly frightened me was the idea that I was losing my mind, and that what I'd seen, or rather what I'd hallucinated, was a symptom of some serious and ever-worsening medical condition. I called my doctor's office from work the next day. My coworkers noticed I wasn't acting myself, but I assured them that I was just feeling a little under the weather, and that I'd already booked a doctor's appointment. A few days later, I'm sitting nervously in her office, and then when she asked me what the problem was, it took me much longer than I thought to finally just say, "I think I'm seeing things." And my doctor was great. She very calmly asked what symptoms I'd been experiencing, and the way she took it all very seriously and professionally made me feel much more at ease. After I'd explained what I'd seen in those woods, she ran a few basic neurological tests and asked me about my sleeping habits, any meds that I was on, and my family's history of mental illness. I told her that I hadn't slept great in the woods that weekend, but generally I was doing okay. I also wasn't on any meds, and I had no family history of psychosis. I figured that she might refer me to a specialist, possibly, but instead, she basically told me I had nothing to worry about. I seemed fit and healthy, so it was most probably a one-off, with a possible combination of exhaustion and dehydration causing my mind to play tricks on me. Obviously, if it happened again, I was to report back to her so further action could be taken, but other than that, I should try not to worry about it. I guess hearing that nothing was wrong with me should have been a relief, and I know that I should have just chalked that up to a one-off mind trickery type thing. But I really couldn't, because hearing all that stuff didn't make what I'd seen feel any less real. I remember the weird hollow thunks as I approached, the unnatural stretching and twisting sound the trees made as they moved, and I remember how silently they were as they rose and fell, like they were moving gently and carefully, trying not to make a sound. It took me a few hours and I realized that I didn't feel reassured at all, because if I wasn't crazy, if I wasn't hallucinating, then what the fuck was that thing? Believe it or not, even as far back as 1997, I was able to get my hands on a computer with access to the internet. It wasn't much back then, but there were still some things like search engines, shout out to Alta Vista, and a bunch of online forums that I could kind of dig through to try and uncover information on what I'd experienced. There was the paranormal section of Delphi forums that proved somewhat useful, and what I found there was a great number of other people who'd endured strange and unexplainable events. RPGNet was also pretty useful, in that there was detailed articles on so-called cryptids that were, at least in part, based on real-world myths and legends. But without a doubt, it was a site called The Well that I had the most luck with. You had to pay a subscription fee to access the site, but that really elevated the quality of the content in that it attracted people you might affectionately call super nerds. The Well also had a dedicated cryptozoology forum, and it was a very serious place. Other forums, especially those dedicated to UFOs and the likes of Usenet, were mostly occupied by wackos claiming to have been anally probed. But those who frequented the Well seemed to employ a much more scientific approach. There were posts about Bigfoot and how, despite the theories on missing lynx-style bipedal apes crossing the Bering Land Bridge 10,000 years ago, their continued existence was biologically impossible. One user wrote that, at least theoretically, dense forests like those in the Pacific Northwest might be able to hide a small population of such mammals. But since there was no DNA or fossil evidence to support their supposed existence, most users agreed it was unlikely that any such creature existed. It was posts like that one which assured me that the Wells Cryptozoology Forum was legitimate, and then after hours of digging through their archives, I came across a post from a since-deleted account that sent chills running up my spine. Its author described the exact same phenomenon I had, almost to the letter, and said that he too had run terrified through the woods. The things hadn't chased him, they hadn't even seemed to acknowledge his presence, but the sight alone was enough to send him fleeing without so much as a second thought. He asked if anyone else had experienced such a thing, and while most of the comments were from users expressing awe or disbelief, only one struck a chord. A user claimed to have seen what he described as a huge stick insect type creature. Something which camouflaged itself as tree trunks and leaves and branches. It was like a moth, the user said. One that's the color of tree bark, something you don't even notice unless you're looking for it or until it moves in front of you. He very correctly stated that there are dozens of other examples of camouflage in nature, and that what we'd all seen was just as natural as a chameleon or a cuttlefish, only much, much bigger. I had to reach out. His comment was almost 6 months old, so I had no way of knowing if he still used that account or not, but still I wrote him an email and then received a reply just a few days later. He lived in San Francisco and invited me over to his apartment so we could discuss and compare what we'd seen. The idea of getting to talk to someone about it who wouldn't think that I was crazy had a massive allure to it. And so one weekend I found myself driving up to San Francisco, checking into a motel, and then heading over to my contact's place the following afternoon. His emails were very well written, so I expected someone fairly normal, at least for cryptozoology. But I guess I was like a drowning man, and he was the only one to throw a rope, because when I met the guy, I realized that I made a huge mistake. He was unkempt, to put it kindly. Wild hair, stained vest, looked and smelled like he didn't shower much, and his apartment was just as repulsive. But I told myself that it could be worth it to talk to someone regarding what we'd each supposedly seen. Yet it only took a few minutes to realize the man wasn't nearly as reliable as I'd first assumed. I won't bore you with all the wacko stuff he came out with. Stuff he claimed was interconnected but sounded like the ramblings of a crazy person. But when he claimed that he could communicate with the giant stick insect which lived out in the woods and would let me see it again for a low, low price of just a few $1,000s, I realized that he wasn't just crazy, but he was trying to scam me too. And I was so goddamned furious that I don't think I could put anger into words. I actually considered just punching him in the face before storming out, but since I was obviously in this psycho's dark, dingy apartment, I knew that it was in my best interest to humor him with a forced thank you and then leave while I still had the chance. When I told him I had to leave, he said that we should swap phone numbers, and I gave him a fake one, and then tried to hide my frustration as I wished him a good afternoon. Once the anger subsided, the disappointment was soul-destroying. I felt like an idiot having placed so much trust in someone like that, and as I continued on the drive back towards San Jose, I realized that I was in serious danger of letting the whole thing ruin my life. I took what I can only describe as a mental step back and imagined myself in 5, 10, or 20 years if I didn't find a way to make peace with what had happened. I saw myself as some complete obsessive hermit living out in the woods, having given up on everything to try and prove I'm not crazy. I saw that thing in the forest eating up a lifetime of potential, turning my own mind into a courtroom where I was a defendant, prosecutor, and shaky eyewitness all at once. Out there in the realm of obsession and mystery, I saw no solid ground on which to stand. I pictured myself trying to tell someone, but only getting an eye roll or a smirk or a, "Yeah, sure, buddy." I pictured someone humoring me for a second before changing the subject, or worse, looking back at me like I'm one step away from a padded room. But that's where the frustration boils up. I've got this thing burning a hole into my memory, something I can't unsee, and because I cannot bring myself to lie, I continue to carry my burden. I have since managed to live somewhat of a normal life, but it can be maddening. Sometimes I feel like I'm trapped, stuck between what I experienced in a world that won't meet me halfway. I can't bring myself to let it go, but holding on to it feels like it's pulling me apart. The anxiety feeds the frustration amps up the anxiety, and round it goes until I'm not even sure who I'm mad at anymore. The thing in the woods, the doubters, or my own rattled head. And now to come full circle, you understand why I have trouble sleeping at night, and why it's such a relief to be able to fall asleep naturally instead of having to rely on medication. It's been a long, long time since I've been able to consider myself at peace, but now, thanks to voices and channels like yours, I'll be able to treat a troubled mind to a few moments of quiet. My buddy and I'll just call him Bud, decided to hit up this camping spot up in New England last fall. You know, one of those let's get away from it all weekends with campfires, cold beer, hot dogs, the whole deal. We picked this for us up near the Vermont state line, someplace called Satan's Kingdom. Look it up if you don't believe me, craziest name for a state park ever. And the name sounded cool and spooky, so we were pumped as we packed up the Jeep with a cooler full of beers and dogs, and then some sleeping bags and a tent that was probably older than my grandmother. We figured that we'd hike into Satan's Kingdom, set up camp, and then just chill and get drunk by a fire for a night or two. Nothing too crazy, nothing too complicated. Turns out, it ended up with one of the most messed up nights of our whole lives. Day one was as near to perfect as it was possible to get. We found this sweet little clearing about a mile in, surrounded by these gnarly old pines that smelled like Christmas. And we set up the tent, got a fire crackling, and then spent the afternoon tossing a frisbee around like a couple of dorks and working up an appetite. When night rolled in, we got to roasting hot dogs and drinking beers, all the while cracking jokes about how we'd totally survive a zombie apocalypse out there. And then day two happened, and things got weird. So it's late afternoon, sun's dipping down, and Bud's off grabbing firewood, and I'm messing with the campfire trying to look like I know what I'm doing. I'm in the process of learning that starting a campfire is much harder than it looks when suddenly I hear Bud start yelling. Real loud too, like he just saw a bear or something. I drop the stick that I'm poking the fire with and book it toward him. He comes crashing through the underbrush, face all pale, eyes bugging out, and holding his arm like it's about to fall off. I ask him if he's okay, and Bud says, "Bugs, man. This huge-ass bug just bit me, like monster movie huge." I figured that he had to be exaggerating. I mean, that's what people do, right? They do it every day. But then Bud shows me his forearm. And damn, there's this gigantic, nasty-looking red welt swelling up, with these two big puncture marks like tunnels into his skin that were oozing some kind of gross-looking fluid. As I looked at the wound, probably with a look of total horror on my face, Bud says, "It was as big as my fist, dude, with these freaky legs and wings, hurt like a son of a bitch." I've never seen him that rattled before. Bud was the same guy who once laughed off a wasp sting to the face at a barbecue. He wasn't some drama queen or insectophobe or anything like that. So seeing him that scared was, well, it scared me too, is what I guess I'm trying to say. We got him back to camp and I dug out the first aid kit, and thank God I remembered it, and slapped on some antiseptic on the bite before wrapping his arm with a bandage. Bud was wincing the whole time, muttering about how it stung like hell, and I said, "You'll be fine, dude. We'll probably just laugh about this later." He didn't laugh, though. He just sat there staring at the fire, looking all twitchy and nervous, and I figured by nightfall that he might perk up, but by the time the sun started going down, he'd gotten way, way worse. Even though it was getting kind of chilly, Bud was sweating buckets and he kept saying that he felt woozy. I was tossing logs on the fire trying to keep him warm, but he ended up huddled up in his sleeping bag, shivering one minute and then kicking it off the next. At one point he says, "Dude, I feel like crap," with his voice all raspy. And his arm looked worse too, swollen with red streaks creeping up from the bite, and you don't have to be a doctor to know that's not good. Around midnight, as Bud started dry heaving into the bushes, I say, "Screw this, we're going to the hospital." Bud's stubborn as a mule, so when I mention the hospital, he says, "No way. Just take me home, dude. I'm not paying $1,000 for them to tell me that I have a fever. Just take me home." I told him whatever, that it was his decision, then we packed our stuff into my old beat-up Jeep and then started to head home. The drive back was a total nightmare, though. It was pitch black as we drove on winding roads through the woods. Bud stayed curled up in the passenger seat, groaning like he was dying. And I was blasting the heat, trying to keep him warm, but he was still shaking. And then about 20 minutes in, he sits up all of a sudden with a scared look on his face. He sounded desperate, and he says, "Pull over, man. I gotta go to the bathroom. Like now." I asked if he could hold it, but he was practically clawing at the door handle already, so I swerved under the shoulder and he bolted out before I could even kill the engine. It's some random stretch of road, just trees on one side and this big dark field on the other. He staggers into the field, disappearing into the shadows, and I'm just sitting there, headlights cutting through the night, thinking how our weekend's gone to hell and how I'm now worried sick about Bud. And then out of nowhere, I hear a scream. Not like a whoops I tripped and fell kind of scream, but a full-on blood-curdling, fear-saturated shriek. My heart damn near stops in my chest, and I'm out of the Jeep in a flash yelling, "Bud, what's wrong?" I'm about to run off into the field when I suddenly see him come limping back fast as he can, face white as a sheet, while his hands were smeared with red up to his wrists. And before I can say anything else, he just yells, "We gotta go, dude." Then as I got back into the driver's seat and him the passenger, he basically yells, "Hospital, now, go." I didn't ask any questions. I peeled out, tires squealing with my pulse thumping. I kept asking Bud what had happened, if he was okay, things like that. But he was just curled up, panting, shaking his head and alternating between telling me not to ask and begging me to get him to the hospital as quick as I could. He was terrified, like I'd never seen him before. Bud always seemed like the kind of guy who'd punch the bear before running away, and now he was a complete wreck. We hit the ER at this little hospital. Docs took one look at Bud and then whisked him off. I was stuck in the waiting room pacing, chugging terrible coffee from a machine while trying not to freak out, and about an hour later, a doctor came out asking me if Bud had been attacked or if he had memory gaps from the last day. I told him all I knew was that Bud had gotten bit by a bug, and that he'd been sick as hell and that I didn't know anything else. They let me see him not long after. He was hooked up to an IV, looking pretty messed up, but he was alive. And doctors said it was some infection, discharged him the next day with antibiotics, but he didn't want to talk about it. He just stared out the Jeep's window on the ride home and was completely quiet. Now, weeks eventually went by, and it took me a while, but I realized Bud was actually ducking me. He wouldn't text me back, wouldn't hang out, so finally I just cornered him in his place, asking, "Dude, what's up? You're freaking me out." And he looked bad, really bad. Jumpy as hell with bags under his eyes, and then after I practically begged him to just talk to me, he invited me inside. It hadn't looked like he'd washed or cleaned his apartment in weeks, but I wasn't about to just leave. He then sat me down, made me swear not to tell a soul, and then in a voice barely above a whisper, he told me everything. He told me that back in the field, when he went off to go take a crap, it felt like it was going to be diarrhea at first. But then nothing came out right away, and it started to hurt really bad, like he was about to crap out a bowling ball. He was finally able to get it out, and he figured that it was just the bug bite messing him up. But when he turned around in the darkness, he saw that there was something moving at his feet. Like whatever had just come out of him, it was moving, squirming around in the grass. He then realized that there was blood all over the backs of his legs, which is why it was on his hands when he got back into the Jeep. And then once he saw all that blood, he freaked and ran. I sat there, jaw on the floor. "What the hell, Bud?" And he wouldn't look at me. He just kept going. "I don't know what it was, dude, but it wasn't normal. I kept dreaming about it, seeing it crawl toward me, hearing it make those wet, clicking noises. I wake up screaming, and sometimes I feel like it's still inside me, waiting." And he was a mess. He wouldn't see a shrink and wouldn't go back to the hospital, and he said they'd either lock him up or cut him open and poke around his insides, and as much as I tried to reassure him, I didn't believe the words coming out of my own mouth. I honestly didn't know if everything he'd experienced was for real, or if his fever had resulted in him, I don't know, having some kind of vivid hallucination that he'd convinced himself was real. It was like something terrible had happened inside of his body, or there was something happening inside of his mind. Either way, it seemed like a lose-lose. And I didn't know what to do, and I really still don't. Part of me still thinks that he just had an extreme reaction to that bug bite, one which made him very sick. But another part of me knows that he doesn't just say stuff like that unless he's 100% serious and certain. He's my best friend, and I'm terrified for him. But what scares me more is thinking about what bit him, the thing that's still out there in Satan's kingdom, and what he believes he left behind in the field that night, covered in his own blood. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you get a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Go subscribe. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, ho, 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 ho. I don't know how